Well, somewhere around the second decade of life and probably into your third decade of life, perhaps most of us, I'm certainly in the camp of those of us who thought this way, most of us thought that there is a certain equation in life that was true. And this is the equation. We thought that rebellion equals freedom. And the reason why we reached that conclusion around the second decade of life for me, it started around the age of 14, it's because all of our lives we're told by parents what we have to do. We're told by teachers what we have to do. Everyone around us tells us what to do, and we don't feel like we have any freedom. So we imagine to ourselves, I know if I rebel, then I will have freedom. And the reason why it's easy to think that is because when we begin to rebel, we feel very free and very liberated for a little while. However, when you ride this conclusion out, this formula out to its conclusion, you discover that the formula isn't true, don't you? In fact, some of you have some pretty good stories you could share about how rebellion led to loss of freedom. Okay, some of you, because of rebellion, you lost some driving freedom. Some of you, because of rebellion, you lost some financial freedom. Some of you lost some movement of freedom, and you got very restricted in where you could go and when. But we find out that this isn't a true formula. So for most of us, as we get older, we just evolve and advance the formula, and we change it to see what might be true, and we think this is true next. Selective rebellion leads to freedom. In other words, you're all for authority, you're all for rules, you're all for law, you're all for structure, all that is very good, but now you begin to analyze on a case-by-case basis what you are supposed to do. And if the rule seems dumb to you, you disregard it. And if the rule doesn't seem to apply to you, you disregard it. And if the rule doesn't seem to move you further downfield, you disregard it. It's not that we reject all authority. It's not that we reject all rules. We just selectively rebel against the rules and against the laws that aren't helpful for us. Here's what it looks like. Speed limit says 45 miles an hour. Well, that's dumb. Everybody knows it should be 55 here, so you selectively rebel against a rule. Or your parents said curfew is midnight, and you said, that's not fair. They're not even up anyway, so you're going to sneak in at 1 a.m. You know, the budget says I can spend $400, but I really want that, so I'm going to bump that up to $600. The IRS says these can't be deductions, but come on, common sense says these should be deductions. So we don't destroy all authority. We're not rebelling against everything, but just on a case-by-case basis, we very selectively rebel. And in fact, it does. Having police around, having laws around doesn't bother you. It does not bother you a bit when you see someone else getting pulled over because they selectively rebelled against a rule. You're fine with that. You're fine with that being enforced. But when it comes to the rules, we look at every rule that comes into our life and we say, what does this rule require of me? And do I think this is a good rule? We get caught in the what of the rule. Whether it's government, whether it's parents, whether it's education system, whether it's boss, whatever it is, policy manual, signed a contract, we look at the what that we are supposed to do, and we decide, you know what, if that what doesn't apply to me, and if I'm clever enough or smart enough or creative enough, I can selectively rebel and have greater freedom on the other side. And if I can guess, when you do this, you don't feel guilty about it. It doesn't leave a mark on your conscience when you do this, and the reason why is because, well, that never should have been a rule to begin with. So when you break it, it doesn't bother you. You never get to the end of the day and say, God, I'm so sorry for what I did, because it doesn't bother you, because we believe on some level that selective rebellion, not all rebellion, selective rebellion leads to freedom. Well, today we are at the halfway point of our series called, we're looking at the life of a man named Abraham. And if you've been with us, I've been saying all along that Abraham was such a big, bold character in history that life didn't happen to Abraham. Abraham happened to life, but it wasn't his vision and it wasn't his ambition that made him this big, bold character in history. It was the calling of God on his life. God had a calling on Abraham's life, and when Abraham answered, when he listened, when he responded to God's calling, that's when big, bold, history-shaping events happened around his life. And what that means for us today is whether or not our lives have the kind of impact they could have, has little to do with potential, has little to do with ambition, has little to do with vision. It has everything to do with God's calling on your life. Because what we believe is that God has a calling for your life. If you are not a Christian and you don't know what that means, I believe the reason you are listening to this message today is because God has a calling on your life. If you are a Christian, God has a calling on your life. And the impact of our lives has to do with whether or not we answer or disregard God's calling on our lives. The problem is, for most of us, the way we selectively rebel against authorities that we have in our lives oftentimes carries over to God's calling on your life. Because when God's calling comes, we tend to respond the way we react to the speed limit sign or what the parents say or what the boss says, and we decide on a case-by-case basis, do I want to follow this rule, or have I decided the what of this rule does not apply to me and I will have greater freedom if I disregard it? When God's calling comes, we're tempted to do the exact same thing. For example, God calls you to forgive, but what she did was too much. And you get caught wrestling with and dissecting, well, what has God called me to do? To forgive this person? I don't know if that's going to lead me where I want to go. And you think about what it is that God has called you to do. God has called you to give generously. But you've got this thing over here you really want to buy, or you've got this thing over here that you really need to pay for, and we get caught up on the what and the situation and the circumstance. We're laser focused on whether or not obeying this calling is going to be good on my life. God calls you, if you're married, to put your spouse's deal ahead of your deal. But in this case, your deal is pretty important, and he doesn't appreciate and she doesn't respect how important this deal is to me, and you're looking at what God has called you to do, and you're thinking, if I ignore what God's calling is, I think that might lead me to more freedom in my life. God has called you to tell the truth even when it costs you something, but then you get to a position where it's really going to cost you something to give full disclosure. And you wrestle with what, in an instance, God has called you to do and weigh whether or not you are going to obey God's calling or practice selective rebellion against God. It comes as no surprise that when we open up the pages of the Bible, what we find is this is not a paradigm that is modeled for us when it comes to following God's calling. In fact, God's word gives us a completely different paradigm, a completely different approach to answering God's calling in our lives. And here's what we find. I'm going to give you the big idea of the message up front today. That way, if you fall asleep or have to leave early, you can still tell someone later what church was all about. And they're like, wow, you really paid attention. Here's our big idea today. God's calling, his calling in your life, isn't about what? Okay? We get hung up on what God has called us to do and whether or not I want to do it. The what's important, but it's not the central thing. It's not the main thing. God's calling isn't about what, but who. Who is it that calls you? Who is it that has a plan for your life? Who is it that redeemed you and loves you? Who is it that has a purpose for your life that is so much bigger than your life and is all about his glory and has eternal implications? When we get hung up on what God has called you to do, you are going to miss it because you are going to selectively rebel against God. But God says, what I've called you to do isn't the main thing. It's an important thing. It's not the central thing. The central thing is, who am I? Who am I that I have called you and asked you in this season to move in this direction? This is what we're going to look at from the life of Abraham today. In today's story from Genesis, we are going to meet two slaves. Both of them had cruel masters. Both of them were oppressed. Both of them were under a larger authority. And both of them had a calling from God on their lives. One of the slaves focuses on what the calling is, and she remains enslaved because she selectively rebels. But the other slave gets past what has God called me to do and focuses instead on who is the God who is calling me, and she answers God's calling, and in doing that, she gains her freedom. Today, we are in Genesis chapter 16. where we find again Abraham living his life in a foreign land, when God's calling shows up again, this time not on Abraham's life, but on the lives of these slaves. Here we are in Genesis chapter 16. Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. Now, the reason why the narrator starts this segment of the story there is because that was key to God's calling and promise for Abraham's life. It was 10 years ago in his life when God called him to migrate to a new country and settle there. So he did, and he went with his nephew and Lot, but they both grew so wealthy as nomads and shepherds, they had to separate because the land could not support them. Well, he's 10 years into this journey now, and he still has no child, and that was central to what God had promised him and what God had called him to become, a great nation. And he's getting old. He's 85 years old, and he and his wife Sarah are starting to worry. So Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go and sleep with my slave, and perhaps I can build a family through her." So Sarai says, God has forbidden me from having children. God has caused this to happen to me, even though he promised me. So since God is keeping this from happening, let's take matters into our own hands. Let's kick open the door that God isn't opening. Let's blaze our own trail. I've got my slave here. Her name's Hagar. She's tall, skinny, cuffed at the bottom and non-pleated, Hagar. Sorry, that was inappropriate. Why don't you sleep with her? And then we can have kids together. Now, this just sounds bizarre to us. Like, what in the world? Are you high, Sarah? What are you thinking? It's like, Abraham, I've got a good idea. Like, what is wrong with you, lady? Now, what she proposes is not original. This is not her idea. It's cultural. In ancient cultures, where slavery was part of the culture, Hagar was Sarah's property. And because Hagar was Sarah's property, her child would be Sarah's property. So if Abraham had a child with Hagar, Abraham would be the father, and the child would be Sarah's property and would become the child of Abraham and Sarah. Now, this was so common in the ancient world that in Hammurabi's Code of Laws, this is actually regulated how you go about doing this. So what she thought of was not original, it was cultural, it was normal, and it was acceptable practice in that day. We say, that's disgusting, that is twisted, and it is, but that's part of their culture. That was part of their world that we lived in. Now, what the next section tells us right here is very important to pay attention to. Abram agreed to what Sarai said. And the reason why that's important is the wording. We don't see it in English, but it's there in the Hebrew language. The narrator has chosen word for word language that has already been used in the book of Genesis. Literally in Hebrew, this says, Abram listened to the voice of his wife. The other place that has already happened was in Genesis chapter 3 when Eve gave Adam fruit to eat from the tree that God said, do not eat it, and the narrator tells us that Adam listened to the voice of his wife. In other words, the narrator is cluing in the reader, here we go again. We are about to unleash horrible destruction into history. That's why these words are there. He agreed to what Sarah said. So, after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived, to which we say, sounds good. What could possibly go wrong here? It's a good plan. That sounds bulletproof to me. Let's go. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, you are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. So, she gets pregnant. All of a sudden, the game changes. Before, she was a foreigner. She was an Egyptian, not a Canaanite. She was a woman, not a man. She was slave, not free. She was nobody. She had to look up to Sarah. She had to talk respectfully to Sarah. Now suddenly she's carrying Abraham's child. She has a status in the household and community that is in some ways greater than Sarah because Sarah was unable to bear a child for Abraham. Now she doesn't look up to her. Now she looks down on her. Now she despises her. And Sarah, it's psychologically traumatic, it's emotionally traumatic. She walks into Abraham's room, slams the tent flap, whatever they did back then, and she says, "You are responsible. This is all your fault, Abraham." She continues, "I put my slave in your arms." That is not what the Hebrew language says. This is a euphemism. It says, "I put her in your lap. I put her between your legs. And now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." So she is calling God in, saying, "I'm the innocent victim. You're the perpetrator. God's going to judge you." She is just a mess. She is emotionally a mess with all of this. Now, Abraham's response is frightening. "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, and she fled from her. His answer is cold and callous. What are you getting all bent out of shape about? She's a slave. Treat her like a slave. So she began to mistreat her. This is the same word the narrator is going to use later to describe what the Egyptian slave masters did to the Israelite slaves when they could not make bricks fast enough. They mistreated them. They beat them. So Hagar, now the victim of abuse, becomes a runaway slave, and she flees into the desert to get away from Sarah. Hagar runs away. So, what's the moral of the story? I have no idea. These are freaky people, and this is not what I thought the Bible was all about. In fact, some of you, honestly, you're confused, you're upset that this is in the Bible and this is how Sarah and Abraham actually behaved, because these are supposed to be heroes of the faith. These are supposed to be people we look up to and emulate. These are supposed to be our moral exemplars, and they are acting with such disgust to us that we can't even imagine they would behave this way. And if they did, why in the world was this recorded in the Bible? Because this should have been buried in the sand in the desert. This story never should have surfaced. And if you're disgusted by this story, may I humbly submit that you need to stop for a moment and consider whether or not you are approaching the text with an open mind. Whether you are approaching the text neutrally, not an open mind as to whether or not this is okay. It's not okay. That's not what this is about. But perhaps you're not approaching the text with an open mind, but with presuppositions. And perhaps you are presuming that the point of the Bible is to tell us inspiring stories of people we can emulate, of people who gave God a good life. And if we follow in their footsteps, and if you give God a good life, then God will give you a good life in return. And we assume perhaps, the purpose of the Bible is to have great heroes, people of excellent morals and ethics and characters, and we are to emulate them. And in so emulating them, God owes us because we have given God good lives. But what if that isn't the purpose of the Bible at all? What if that isn't the purpose of the Scriptures? If you're offended, maybe the actual purpose of the Bible is something different than what you assumed it was. Because there is no good life here. There is no moral exemplar here for us to learn from. The message of the Bible is not give God a good life and then God will give you a good life. But the message of the Bible is primarily about God and what He has done. The primary message of the Bible is not a message of example, it's a message of gospel. It's a message of good news. It is the story not of us, it is the story of God, and how God's grace comes to undeserving people. God's grace shows up in the lives of wicked people, unworthy people, shameful people. God's grace shows up and intervenes in their lives, in the lives of people who do not understand it, in the lives of people who resist it, in the lives of people who do not value it after they have been saved by it. It is a story of gospel. It is a story of good news. It is a story of God's work in the history of mankind, not man's work in the history of mankind. And why is Sarah so completely undeserving of God's grace? Is it because she follows the norms of her culture? Is it because she behaves in a way that is perfectly reasonable considering her culture and her cultural values? No, there's something else going on here. We see clearly that Hagar is enslaved, and she's enslaved to a cruel mistress. What the narrator also wants us to see is that Sarah is also enslaved. She's enslaved to what her culture has told her. Repeatedly throughout the story, we've been told over and over and over again that Sarah was barren. Sarah was barren. She had no children. Sarah is barren. And that's a word we don't use really anymore today. And I think that's a good thing that we don't use that word in America because it carries massive implications. The implications the word barren carries is this. It says, if a woman cannot have a child, you have no value as a woman. If a woman cannot have a child, you have no purpose as a woman. In her ancient culture, family was everything. Being married and having children was everything in that world. And that world said, if you cannot have a child, then what purpose do you have as a woman? What value do you have as a woman? And she wanted more than anything to have that value and that sense of worth. So she did anything to try and gain that sense of worth. And we look at that and we say, how oppressive, how terrible, that ancient culture. I'm so glad we don't live in a place like that. That was so oppressive and demeaning to women and slaves and foreigners. It was sexist, it was racist, it was everything horrible we despise in our world today as Americans. But and I want to say this with all sensitivity. Did you know that the experts tell us that in the ancient world, women did not have eating disorders? In fact, in our world today, in very traditional cultures, eating disorders are almost unheard of. Why would that be? There is no such thing as a culture that does not say, you must have this, you must be that, or you are worthless as a person. Every culture says, if you do not have that, if you cannot be that, you are worthless as a person. In America, the way we say it is this: you're free to marry whoever you want. You're free to be anyone you can be. Isn't that the message of the movie Frozen? Be whoever you want to be. Let it go, right? I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to sing it. It's going to be in your head all day. I don't even need to sing it, do I? Every culture says you need to have that. You're not free in America to marry whoever you want to marry. You're not free to do whatever you want to do. You're free to marry whomever you can attract. You're free to do whatever you can actually go out there and hopefully gain some kind of advantage so you can do. Our culture says if you don't have wealth, you're worthless. If you don't have looks, if you don't have beauty, if you don't have smarts, if you don't have that, you're worthless as a person. She was just going along with what her culture told her she needed to have value as a person. What about you? Where do you feel enslaved by culture? Where is our culture telling you if you don't have that, you have no value as a human being? If you want to know where that is, here's how you find out. You pay attention to what God has called you to do and where you practice selective rebellion. God called Sarah, you're going to have a son with Abraham, but you're going to wait until my timing comes. She couldn't follow God's plan because she had to have value as a woman. She had to have a child, so she took it into her own hands. And she could not trust what God called her to do because she lost complete sight of who is the God who has called me. And she got all focused on the what, and when God didn't show up, she kicked the door open. Where do you do the same thing? You get selective in what God has called you to do, and you weigh the what. You look at the what. You get hung up on the what, and you lose sight of who God is that has called you. That's going to show you where your idols are. That's going to show you where you are an inner slave like Sarah was. That's going to show you what you're truly looking to for value and worth besides God himself. Well, because Hagar's mistress is a slave herself, it quickly becomes abusive. So she runs away into the desert. Here's what happens when she does. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. Now imagine you're Hagar. You have been abused by a crazy lady. You are running for your life, and God shows up and says, I want you to go back and submit to crazy lady. It would be so easy to get hung up on what God is calling me to do right now. But verse 10 tells us why God would have her walk back into that situation. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. Go back and submit to her. Why? Because right now you do not have any freedom, Hagar. If you survive the desert pregnant, you will be a fugitive slave for the rest of your life. I'm calling you to go back. And what we can read ahead and find out is God is calling her to go back because by the end of her story, she will gain her freedom. But the path to God blessing her is to lead her back into adversity, through hardship and through great trial and difficulty. And if she focuses on what God has called her to do, she already knows the answer because she already ran away. But look at how God reveals to her who he is, so that she can listen to him. It goes on. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him. Again, you wouldn't make this up. You mean if you made it up, it'd be, he'll be a prince and a gentleman. No, he's not. And he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me, for she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. Hagar is going to obey the what. And the only reason why is because now she knows the who. If there was a God, I thought you could not see me because my life is a mess and I am the victim and I am being hurt. God says, I know you are. I see that, Hagar. I see you. But I am going to call you to remain in a season of adversity for a time because I intend to bless you, and this is the path of my calling, and this is the path for my blessing. Look past the what, endure the what, embrace the what because of who, and that is the God who sees you, the God who knows you. Have you ever wondered, does God see me in my adversity? Because God, listen, God will delay your plans. God will detour your path. Can you live with a God like that? Can you live with a God who sometimes calls you into adversity and into trial? Hagar can because she knows the one who calls her. We follow a God who always answers your prayers the exact way you would have asked him to if you knew everything he knew and if you saw everything he can see. But since we cannot see what he can see, we do not know how to pray rightly. But God says, I'm the God who sees. I am the God who knows how many hairs are on your head. Can you trust a God who will call you into adversity? Hagar does because of who God is, not because of what God has called her to do. So she goes back. She goes back to Abraham's household, has the boy, Ishmael is born, and he begins to grow up. Well, fast forward, we're going to skip a few chapters right now. We're going to backfill them in the next few weeks. We're going to skip ahead to the Hagar story so we can tie a bow on that. Eventually, the son of promise, Isaac, is born, and it's 14 years after this event. And when Isaac is born, all of a sudden, all those tensions flare up again between Sarah and Hagar. And Sarah, again, she just can't handle anymore what happens when Isaac is born. So it says, the child grew, that's Isaac, 14 years later. The child grew and was weaned. And on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar, the Egyptian, had borne to Abraham was mocking. Won't even say his name. And she said to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son, Isaac. The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God said to him, do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring. So Sarah says, get rid of her. Abraham's like, God, what do I do? It's my son. God says, send her. Sarah's perspective is get rid. God's perspective is send, and you can send her because now this is my calling, that she would have freedom. And Abraham, Ishmael was the son of your effort. Isaac was the son of my grace. I waited until you were completely too old to have a son before Sarah conceived and gave you a son. And in fact, in the New Testament, in Galatians chapter 4, we're not going here today. You can make a note of that if you want further study. In Galatians chapter 4 says these women and these sons represent two different things. Hagar and Ishmael, that's the son through achievement. They went out and they did what was in their power and they achieved a son. Isaac was the son of receivement. And that is how God's grace comes to us. When God calls and all we can do is wait to receive his blessing, he will make us wait to receive. If we achieve, God says, that's not my blessing, that's not my purpose. No, because I'm a good God, I will bless him, Abraham. Don't you worry about Ishmael. He will be a great nation because he's your son. But Isaac is the son of receivement, of receiving my grace and my divine intervention. So God has him sent away for their new life. Well, the beginning of the journey, it works out in the end, but the beginning of the journey was not a good one. Verse 21. Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down about a bow shot away, for she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there, she began to sob. God heard the boy. Hagar sobbing. God hears the boy crying. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt. God sends him. He says, don't worry about Ishmael. I will bless him, and he will be a great nation. And that's what ended up happening to him. Now, here's what's so interesting about this story. Hagar is the slave to Sarah. It is when she obeys God's calling on her life that she finds the path to freedom. Sarah is a slave to her culture, and she is struggling to obey God's calling in her life, and she remains a slave. We'll find out in the next weeks if she ever does gain her freedom from that, by the way. But it's a cultural enslavement. What about you? Where are you tempted to take the shortcut rather than wait on God's timing? Where are you tempted to weigh what God has called you to do while you lose sight of who the God is who called you? How can we gain the perspective and patience and courage like Hagar to follow God's calling even when it is a road through great adversity and trouble? The answer is all right here in this text. Hagar is sobbing as her boy lies dying. But the angel of the Lord, the angel of God, does not hear Hagar sighing. He hears the boy crying out. And that's the character in the story, the silent character who truly deserves so much empathy in all of this. Poor Ishmael. He's thrown out of his father's home. He's dying of thirst. He's crying out for someone to save him. But the Lord hears his cries, and the Lord saves him. But do you see the one to whom this points? There's someone much greater than Ishmael who was sent out of his father's house. There's someone much greater than Ishmael who thirsted. Someone much greater than Ishmael who cried out to God as he was dying. But when Jesus was being crucified on the cross and he cried out to God, God did not answer the cries of the only Son. And the reason why God did not answer the cries of Jesus is because Jesus was dying a substitutionary death for those of us who have selectively rebelled against our Father in heaven. For those of us who get so caught up in saying, well, what has God called me to do? And can I really do that? And we've lost sight of who is the sovereign, creator, almighty God who calls us. He was laying down his life for those of us who have selectively rebelled against him. That's why the Father did not listen to his cries. So that through Jesus, he would listen to yours. So that he would be the God who sees you. So that he could be the God who listens to you. Because who is he? He is the God who loves you, who through Jesus redeemed you. And yes, he will call you to walk through adversity on your way to his greater blessing and ultimately future in heaven with him. So where are you tempted to not trust God in what he has called you to do? How do you remember who is the God who called you? Let's wrap up with this. This is what we found in this text today. Number one, God sees you. He is the God who sees. Are you in trouble? Are you in adversity? Does what he called you to seem unreasonable right now? He sees that. He sees you. He knows how many hairs are on your head. This is the God who sees. That's what Hagar learned. That's who God is. Second thing we learned, he's the God who hears you. When you cry out, he hears, he listens, he even answers. He's the God who sees, he's the God who hears, and he cares, and we know that because he's the God who saved you. He saved you through the death of Jesus Christ. He substituted himself for you. That's why we can trust him. He cares about you that much. And finally, he's the God who calls you for his glory, for his kingdom, for his divine purposes, and ultimately your blessing. See, maximum freedom is not found in selective rebellion. It is found in remembering who is the God who calls. So you can gladly trust what he is calling you to do. Let me pray for you. Father in heaven, thank you for this incredible story. While the culture in that day was so different than ours, the truth is so practical for us today. Father, for everyone listening who already knows where they are rebelling against you, I ask that you will give them eyes to see not primarily what you have called them to do, but who you are. God, you are sovereign. You are creator. You are redeemer. You are the one who loves us and sent your Son to die for us. That's who you are. May we trust in that grace so that whatever you have called us to in this season, we will gladly obey, knowing that it is for your glory and ultimately for our freedom. Give us wisdom to know how to apply these truths and give us courage to do it. We ask it in the name of Jesus, our Redeemer. Amen.